account, which looked like a black hole, suddenly does the biggest comeback since Lazarus. It just sorts itself out. Unfortunately, it was too late. We see the increased interest cycle on Tito and Mboweni. Right at the top of that wave, he gets called in by Zuma and says, now listen here, chap, you carry on at that rate, you're going to go on early retirement. So we see that the interest rate comes smashing down as the current account improves. And we say, well, you know, that's great, but it wasn't great enough to save Tito, and he was moved out. You know, so that was the end of him. We've got the strong rand back in spite of low interest rates. We're strong against the US dollar. Our strength is still there against euro, and well, against pound. Who can't beat the pound? The Palms have had a disastrous year. The Queen's had to take a job. He's gone back into the military, and Gordon Brown's just on fire. So anybody who can't beat the Palms this year, well, you know, that's just basically where we are. We saw the end of Tito, and I was sad about that. I think Tito, 10 years ago, took the enormously risky decision and hard decisions to go into a low interest rate society. Drop your interest rates. It was him that did that, not Trevor Manuel. But when it got hot last year, it was Tito and not Trevor who was pushed to one side and is now selling toilet paper. That's a bit like a Ferrari dragging a Fender trailer along, I think, but anyway. Individuals, taxpayers, always the load comes home to them. What we see is right across the Trevor Manuel era, we see the reduction in the burden on individual taxpayers. Every year for 10 years, we're going to give you a reduction. And so that took us back to the perfect position where we wanted to be, where individuals tax contributes a third, 30%, VAT another 30%, and company tax another 30%. As we've seen, VAT and company tax evaporated, so more and more of the burden through fiscal drag and bracket creep comes back on the individual taxpayer, and they start moving back towards the 40% mark. And that is a danger. That is the cancer that actually killed us in the closing years of apartheid. That is something that we've worked for 10 years to get rid of. So in 2009, Trevor Manuel has to adjust for inflation. He says, to adjust for inflation, we needed to increase the bottom bracket from 122 to 132 and the top bracket to 533. The way he goes in Parliament is he says, I have given you the biggest economic stimulus package since Keynes, 13.55 billion. But in fact, all he had done was get the 132 and got close to the 533 with the 525 top rate of tax. What we see, though, is an interesting amendment starting last year, is massive increases here on the tax threshold, 54,200 and 84,200 for geriatrics. So what are we doing? We're saying we're favoring the lower end of the taxpayer. When we go to Parliament this year, we're expecting very little. So the 132 would have to go to about 140 to keep pace with inflation, and the 520 would have to go to 556. What we were frightened of was that another bracket would come in at about 1 million at 42%. What actually happened was we got the 140, exactly, fiscal drag adjustment, and we got 552 instead of 556 at the top end of the bracket. So your 5.3 billion rand package of yesterday is enough to keep inflation at bay. And we could say, well, what else happened? And they say, well, we also got the bottom brackets up, tax threshold now at 57,000 for under 65s and 88,528 for over 65s. So now we're saying, is that it? And we say, yeah, but hang on. Are we not missing something? He gave us 5 billion yesterday, and all the press has picked that up. But when the press got a press lockup, they leave last year's budget behind. What happened in last year's budget was the announcement not of your decrease in taxes, 3,500 rand a year. That will buy me a case of French champagne. But on the 1st of March, I lose my travel allowance between home and work. So in last year's budget explanatory memorandum to the Taxation Laws Amendment Act, they said that by 2005, 517,000 South Africans were claiming a travel allowance deduction. And they were doing this primarily between home and work. And the average deduction for a South African then was 35,000 rands a year. At 40% tax rate, that would be around 15 to 20,000 rands a year that you were getting off your tax on your car. That disappears on the 1st of March. So if I got 3,000 back on the budget, I lost 15,000 from last year's amendment, I'm 12 down. And that's before they put the fringe benefit on your group life payment as well. So I've got to say, sorry, I'm 15,000 rand poorer today than I was yesterday. But you see, what's clever about it politically is that you're not looking at last year's amendment only coming into effect this year. So it's not all that rosy. The interest exemption is upped every year. That's to provide employment to academics so that they can change every worked example that we ever do, and to sell more examples of Huxham and Hout. The employer increases in medical aid subscription also confuse everybody. That going up from 625 to 670 for the first two dependents and 380 to 410 thereafter. It was announced last year that we would get a non-refundable rebate to replace this whole system, so as to spread it around a bit. That has been delayed till 2012. That was almost a dead cert for yesterday's budget that didn't happen. The employer tax-free medical aid contributions are tiny. They're worth about 265 rands per month. And what we see is that they grow by about 10 or 20 rands a month per year. And what we see with all of this is it's hardly worth having. It doesn't even pay for your blood pressure tablets, let alone everything else you've got to take today. Then we have the lump sum tax tables, right? We have a table now for pre-retirement payments and the divorce settlement payments, what we explain to the students as the tiger tables. What we're going to basically use those for are divorce settlements and all the rest of it. We see 0 to 22,500 on a voluntary withdrawal, then 18% to 600,000, which is not too bad, but it gets very expensive thereafter from 600 at 27%, over 900,000, 36%. So yes, you can have your money, but you're going to pay for it. We also have a table now, what we call the old croc table. That's the croc that they found in Germiston Lake there, basically saying 0 to 300,000 tax-free, 300 to 618%, which gives an average of 9% on 600,000. That's quite nice. The big thing about these tables is that they've been there for nearly 3 years, and we still haven't had a fiscal drag adjustment on them. When we look at the old tables, they were not adjusted for 20 years. So we've got a lot of work to do there. When one looks at what retirement planning is all about, it is so not about getting your money out of the retirement fund. You can now draw annuities of 305,000 rands a year for mom and dad without going over the 30% tax rate, plus 32,000 rands worth of tax-free interest. You can have a tax-efficient medical aid living annuity, and you need all of that plus 600,000 rand per taxpayer in lump sums before we even approach a tax problem. When people say they have a tax problem on their retirement, I say, gee, have you got more than 10 million rand? And they say, no, I've got 2. And I say, well, then you haven't got a tax problem. Your annuities are not even going to get you over tax threshold. So the retirement industry is in a bit of a problem. And the biggest casualty from the global credit crunch is that we are a further 5 years off on our retirement plans. Then, of course, we get to the annual abatements. And I'm pleased to see that, obviously, the new Minister of Finance does not have shares in Huxham and Hout. He hasn't changed all of these abatements. And everybody homes in and they say, well, forget about CGT and all the rest of it. And nobody makes donations anyway because we have to rely on the reasonable maintenance of the taxpayer's family, which is a separate exemption to the basic donation tax exemption. What people worry about is the 3.5 million estate duty threshold, which has not now been moved for a number of years. And they say, well, what are they doing? Are they looking to make this a major income stream for the future? And we say no. The 3.5 million Section 4A allowance, okay, is not what estate duty planning is about. What they have done is that they have changed the principles of estate duty with 2 major amendments leading up to this. And you don't have to form a trust to deal with this, because in the future what we are going to do is say, for the meantime, you can get around estate duty by simply saying, in the old days we used to go determine market value, give 3.5 million to your kids, send the balance to your wife,